You're listening to Data Center Therapy. Please take a number, and an engineer will be right with you. Welcome back, everybody, to yet another episode of Data Center Therapy, a podcast from Ivoxy Consulting that talks all things IT with a healthy dose of empathy. I'm your host, Matt, another episode again, Yeti, and alongside me is my co-host, Matt Cozzolino.
Good morning. Or good
Each
day.
episode, we dive into the wide range of technologies that make up this beautiful sandbox called IT that we all play in. We share our hopes and dreams, opinions both positive and critical alike, all with a touch of empathy, because at the end of the day, we all need a seat on that couch. So last week, we started with our Hands-on-Demand Lab series, right, Mr. Cozzolino?
Yes, we did. Hands on demand, or is it just hands on?
Hands-on-demand.
On demand. Yeah.
That was an on-demand lab, hands-on lab,
There we go.
amalgamation. Amalgamation?
Amalgamation.
Amalgamation.
You never know
There we
it's
go.
first thing in the morning. How could anybody ever guess?
When
Yes.
did we record this? Yeah.
Yeah, I think people can probably pick the spot right now. Anyway, so we talked about our challenges, and we started a series with last week's episode that was basically the first bookend to our second VMworld Redux event. Well, no Redux today, but something just as special. So this is part 2 in that series, but we're bringing on the man himself who walked the plank, so to speak, and really put his neck out there to revive and revitalize
First one.
our training curriculum that we've historically done, but the last couple of years kind of lulled. We kind of got into
Kind of hit
a
pause
mode
or
where
something.
what do people really want to dive into? And so Shane was the one to raise his hand, our own resident Canuck,
Good
right?
job,
Mr.
good
That's
job.
not derogatory, is it? That's just explanatory. Mr. Bradley, how are you today?
I am doing great, thank you. Glad to be back.
Well,
That was an affectionate term, by the way, Shane. The Canuck.
The Canuck, yeah, it is.
I want you to take it that way.
Yeah, no, it's all good. The Canadian ski team was always referred to as the Crazy Canucks. So
Is the Vancouver hockey team still the Canucks?
they are, yeah. Too
oh,
bad though.
that's what it was. Yeah. I know I'd heard that like on the radio all the time.
I think we'll only all be happy once everybody just starts calling themselves the city football team or the city baseball team or the city hockey team. Then we can have nothing to argue about, and it'll be all great, right?
That's
There you go.
exactly it.
Names mean so much, though.
Yes. Well, Shane, thank you for way back. Thank you for taking on the first batter up, basically leadoff hitter, to the refresh of our labs. But you were not only instrumental and obviously completely centrally key to teaching the class, obviously, but setting up the requirements and helping us, Kaz and I, as more or less architects of the lab, to know what does this thing look like? Because we could sit there and build a lab and
Yeah.
run with it and say, we think this should be this, and you're over there saying, wait, this is not what I need. So it was an effort and big time collaboration to kind of level on the same page.
Yeah, it was. I got to throw a lot out to you and Matt for helping build the lab. I think we got to give some credit to Alec for providing input on previous courses and stuff that Ivoxy put on. So good that way, and of course, Eric for opening up the purse strings and revitalizing the lab.
Yeah, it was cool. I mean, purse strings is a good point, right? I was nervous at first because as an ops guy at heart, I always treated every dollar my companies that I work for spent as my money. So
There was
I have a
definitely
tendency.
that, yeah.
I had a tendency when I own the infrastructure to almost cheap out. Like, no, I can do
No.
it. I can do it.
We don't need that. Let's make this work. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes during our conversations in the lab, it was the people who hold the purse strings. Well, what about this? What about that? And
Let's
I'm
add
just
this,
like,
add that. Yeah. No, we
Yeah,
don't really
right.
need that. Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
so I appreciated that out of them. They could have
there
been
was
a lot bigger sticklers.
there was some work we had to do, to your point, Yeti, of not really knowing what we needed to build in the lab. So it's kind of taking that approach of working with a customer, and Shane ended up kind of being the customer at that point, right? So how'd you come up? Because I remember having having that question with you, having that conversation with you, Shane, of what set of resources do you need, how much memory, how much CPU, how'd you come up with that?
Well, I had a pretty lengthy conversation with Alec due to his previous experience with the lab and such, and we truly wanted to make it, a full-featured, powerful lab that students weren't going to see delays and lag and all that kind of stuff within the lab. So we kind of relied a lot on our own experience of what it took to actually run, a virtualized environment.
But you have a separate challenge because how many of your customers, Shane, that you work with are running a ESXi hypervisor nested inside an ESXi hypervisor, and the challenges that can present? Probably not a lot.
Not a lot, no. No, I wouldn't say so.
So I know we had
When
some.
you're teaching a vSphere class and upgrades in vCenter, it kind of begets. You're certainly not going to be teaching
Right.
it on our production ESXi hosts.
Yeah, it's a lot different to set up a virtualized nested environment than it is to walk into a customer's environment and go, hey, you got all this horsepower and stuff like
Mhm.
that. Let's do the upgrade, as opposed to, we want to try and build a lab that can support, 16, 20 students and still have a lot of resources left over for that. So
So you had started building actual VMs, those nested ESX VMs, and some of the other machines that you needed to support your class, kind of offline at home in your own set of gear, right?
I did, yeah. I started on my laptop on VM Workstation. I had 32 gigs of RAM in it and was trying to build out the lab. And then, you know, we kind of all as a team kind of had that conversation of, what hardware do we want to look at? So I bit the bullet and bought a 2-blade micro chassis, 128 gigs per blade in it for at home, my own home use, I guess. And that worked out great building up the lab. And then, we kind of set these are the resources that we want for our VMs, and then took it back to, the powers that be at Ivoxy and said, you need to buy all this equipment for us to make the lab work. And lo and behold, that's where we are today.
So it kind of fit. I remember doing that. How much memory do you need? And then times what, 20 times 16 plus a
Yeah.
plus a couple of percent. And yeah, we made it.
Yep. Yeah, and it worked out good because we wanted to kind of have roughly resources for up to 20 students. One of the classes we had that was 16 people in it, and thankfully Mr. Yeti here kind of provisioned a full 20 pods. We kind of had them all up and running to make sure that we could support that. And then, if a student kind of blew up their portion of the lab, we could just reassign one of the other pods to them, and that worked out
Have
really
some
well
backups
too.
there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it was surprising because I think we've all been spoiled by the march towards denser cores and denser RAM configurations. And a typical workload of VM, you could chip away with a lot of pretty robustly configured virtual machines and still, have plenty of headroom left over. We see that in our customers' environments too. They've built in that capacity. When you're spinning up a lab environment times 20, and that lab environment is, I don't know, 512 megs of RAM, or maybe not that high. Sorry, um, something like 128 gigs of RAM, let's say, right, between all 6 VMs or something like that. And do the math. Even though memory sharing and all of that it affects you, when you see those needles start creeping to 70, 80, 90%, you're like, yeesh, we would not be in good shape if we lost a host right now.
Yeah, exactly. I think when we built out, each pod was 60 gigs of RAM. It worked out to be, I think. Yeah.
That's not bad.
And that was a couple of
yeah.
virtual hosts and a couple of vCenters and a couple of other VMs to support.
You're
all the
over a
infrastructure
terabyte
there.
of provisioned RAM for your class.
Yeah, because we had to take into account one of the things we wanted to do was start them on a Windows box and have them do their own upgrades, which I think is a great thing for every customer to be able to do. And we had to account for what was running, and then also doing the migration to the VCSA. We kind of had to account for that RAM, even though it was somewhat temporary of both boxes on while the data transferred, and then the old box gets shut down. But we did have to account for all that. So.
Yep. I mean, the underlying components can be a little thirsty too. Given that we're virtualizing our network now, we've now shifted that burden from a really rich layer 3 device to software.
Yeah, there's a lot more supporting VMs that are taking up a good chunk of that resources that we described. We might have even
Right.
undersized that a little bit.
Yeah, that's one thing that, and after having hands-on with NSXT in this class, I am 10 times as excited about it as I was before. Like, it's okay,
You need
yes,
that use
this,
case.
I really wish everybody would jump in with both feet. I realize it's not a free product, right? So there's going to be some, value cost proposition discussions. But yeah, having that use case and then using it, it's incredible. But like I mentioned, you've got NSX managers, you've got distributed edge devices. What am I looking for, Kaza? What term am I
The
looking
edge
for? Though?
VMs, the edge
Right.
edge nodes, edge
Edge
transport
nodes.
nodes. That's what I'm looking
Yeah.
for. Yeah.
Transport nodes. Thank you. And I mean, I've got a little 3-node. I've got a fourth Supermicro box too that's got more RAM, but I got a 3-node, 32 gigs each NUC cluster. Well, vSAN chews up about 30% of the RAM on each NUC, and there's 22 gig left over per host, and vCenter takes 8 gig, and NSX Manager takes, and before you know it, you're like, great, I've got a virtual network and no room to run
two
anything
gigs of
on
memory
it.
for VMs. Yeah.
Hope you
So-
like headless Linux.
We had a couple of tasks happening kind of in parallel. So you were developing the VMs, doing some work in your own lab while we were actually sourcing hardware, getting it built, getting it put together, waiting for stuff to ship. And then there was that moment where, okay, now everything's ready, upload your stuff. And
Yep.
I feel like you had to go through, you built this thing and then uploaded it and had to basically redo all of it now that you've got this other set of hardware there. What was that process like for you?
It wasn't too bad, because building an ESXi host isn't, all that difficult. So we kind of did that. One of the big things that we wanted to do was make sure that we could mimic exactly what we had in the student environment or the training environment, I guess is probably a better way to put it, as to what somebody could actually do in their own environment. So with it being nested, we wanted to make sure that we gave, I believe it was 8 virtual NICs to every host, just so
Yeah.
they could segregate their traffic, which they should be doing anyway. But we didn't want to just go, yeah, here's two vNICs and you can run everything on here. We actually wanted to make it as realistic as possible for what people could be doing in their own test environments. And there's no reason that a nested environment can't look like your, somewhat production environment today. So that's really what the goal was to aim for.
But then we had challenges with VLAN sub tagging, right, Matt?
Yeah, so the whole pod is running on NSX. So Shane, you just mentioned that we had 8 network adapters presented, and I know it's been a while since I've worked on a physical ESX server with 8, 10 network adapters. That was back when
That's when you're still at 1 gig.
that was
typically.
1
Yeah.
gig, and here's my iSCSI network, here's my this network.
Yep.
So yeah, we did have some growing pains, which as we're getting ready for our next class here, we've addressed those with some of the scripting tools and being able to do that. So we've actually had to wait for versions to roll forward. But that's why we ended up with those 8 adapters. There was some what else? There was some MAC address stuff with ESX that was kind of fun too.
Yes, there
For a
was.
while,
yes.
we were show stopped on trying to go with let's talk about what a 2 network with trunk ports with VLAN tags looks like nested, and I think we were running into issues there, right?
Yeah, so specifically what it was because we were deploying everything with Terraform, we
Yeah.
needed to be able to set the value to say allow VLAN tags on this overlay segment. And we couldn't because the Terraform provider didn't have it.
The
I went
NSX
so far as
provider
to
for Terraform.
I found it in the next version as they were ready to release it, and it's there, it's ready. We just need that next version, right?
Yeah,
So is that something that we could have pulled that down and built our own provider or our own fork of the provider if we really wanted to, right?
I guess.
I mean, fever dream all the way. Don't get me wrong. I'm not.
Yeah, that gets kind of deep into the weeds there. That I'm not ready to go that far.
Yeah,
My
I
boots
hope you
aren't
like that dog
tall.
food because you're eating your own.
Yeah, so just
Oh,
to,
man.
just to be clear, it wasn't a limitation of VMware. It was the Terraform provider of the way we're deploying the lab that was our issue.
Right. So the other solution would have been go touch physically through the GUI each one of those segments and set the value that we needed. So it was there. We just couldn't set it through the script that we're using to provide.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I make a I'm going to make a judgment call here, and you can say if you think I'm right or you think I'm wrong. I'm all right with that. Am I right in saying that all of this technology, all this framework, Terraform, it feels and the providers that plug in and if you're not familiar, a provider is basically okay. Terraform is a framework and it uses its own Terraform HashiCorp language HCL to define states that you want your infrastructure to be in. And there's providers like AWS provider and Azure, and it's more or less of another word for a plugin that allows Terraform to provision infrastructure in those environments. There's a vSphere provider, an NSX provider, a Pure Storage provider, and they all have varying states of deployment compatibility. It might be 20% feature complete on what you can do with the Pure through the GUI or API calls. It might be 100% complete with what you can do with vSphere API or whatever. They all feel very much like very targeted, not all. Certainly the cloud hyperscalers are going to have an awful lot of support and use. But you start to venture off that very worn path down the middle of the fairway. And I feel like, how many people are really doing this outside of us right now? Like, I hear this is the greatest thing ever, this and that. And it feels like about 6 people on the planet might be doing it, and one might be still on the internet
Sometimes
talking about
you see
it.
the same 3 or 4 people on the blog posts or the forums asking about questions. Yeah, that's definitely the case.
And that's not, I mean, that's a judgment, but it's not a cut. It's not meant to be a shot at it. It's just, you feel like this very well may be the future in a lot of ways. But I almost feel like we're Lewis and Clark out here, or right behind the pole position, and there's not a ton of it out there just yet. There's a ton of talk about it, not a ton of it out there just yet.
There's a bit of a disconnect. So Terraform does the core orchestration of everything, and AWS runs the compute side and has the APIs, and someone needs to write that provider that plugs into Terraform to talk to AWS or
Terraform
vCenter
or the myriad
NSX
of different automation tools too.
So they're marching their portion forward, and AWS is marching their stuff forward, and someone has to manage that piece in the center. And my understanding is that it's AWS is managing their provider plugin, VMware and the NSX team is managing their NSX plugin. So,
but you get a little bit off the side of the road there, and who's managing it? Matt Cozzolino as a pet project.
Yeah, then you go look at the code. You go look at those things, and there's one person up in Vancouver that's got 700 commits over the last 3 weeks.
And if you're not staying on top of it, AWS marches forward.
Yep.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, they're not waiting on you. Yeah, so it's, again, I think that goes in one direction, though, too. I think it gets more popular. I think you get more people on the teams, more people involved in using the products and using that method of accessing the products.
And
it gets more support.
Point. Yeah.
Right. But I there were a lot of times where I'm reading the docs. I'm like, this should work. Is anybody else having this problem? Is anybody else out there?
Anyone there? So I know we had some reconfiguring around the network to do. I think we went back and forth around local storage presented to the ESX host versus you actually went so far as to build a virtual storage array that we virtualized as well.
Yeah, you bet. So we utilized essentially FreeNAS, so we could do multi-protocol with iSCSI NFS on it. We did have that conversation. I do recall that do we want to expose our physical array to each student so they could kind of start building their own LUNs and stuff, and we kind of decided against that. So that's why we went with the FreeNAS. It provided what they needed, and they could do storage vMotions and move stuff to NFS, iSCSI, all that. So it was good from that perspective in the lab that everybody's isolated and not beating each other up.
I set up TrueNAS, Shane, which I believe is the new version of FreeNAS. I think they're a company. They bought FreeNAS. They still have a free product, but that's moving to the TrueNAS platform.
I was exploring that as well, and it looks like they're getting into the actual storage vendor hardware. You're buying an array from us game
on the commercial side. So I mean, from a home labber, I have got no interest in that, right? So, but at home, I have the aforementioned Supermicro box with an SSD in it. that also participates in that 4-node vSAN cluster. And so we were talking on a couple episodes ago how I got the little Raspberry Pi ARM,
Mhm.
and I got ESXi running on it, and I was building up my video camera distribution, but I didn't want to use their hardware, blah blah blah. So I got it working right, but I said, okay, I don't have any storage on this Pi, so right now I was using my Synology NFS share. Well, that's 8 SATA drives. And I'm like, if I ever want to put any I/O down this thing, not only am I going to have horrific performance, I'm going to tank everything else on this Synology array, not meant for VM traffic, obviously. So I'm like, ooh, I've got that nice 4-node vSAN cluster with like 6 terabytes of was accelerated hybrid space. Great. I'll just hook up I'll just present an iSCSI data store out to my Raspberry Pi ESXi host. No, you won't. Did you know this?
No.
They do not allow you. So vSAN has an iSCSI target service. So vSAN can say, hey, SQL, here's an iSCSI LUN, so you can do your clustering and all that fun stuff without VMDKs, files.
Mhm.
Fine, whatever. Nope. It will not allow an ESXi host to be a client, to be an initiator for that service.
No.
It's meant to get around. It's meant to prevent you from getting around the licensing of it, from what I understand. But I'm like, man, how am I gonna? That sucks. Like, is there a hack around it? Nope. So, I ended up spinning up a TrueNAS VM that's VMDK files lived on vSAN. And is obviously
Inception all the way
distributed.
down, right?
And then it presented a LUN out as on a VM network, and then that VM was on the same network, and I attached to the LUN that way. So the storage and all of TrueNAS still lives on vSAN, but yeah. So I kind of aped your idea on that, Shane.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'll even point out that Ivoxy wants to kind of keep ahead of the curve. I think obviously you guys have proved that with Terraform. But if TrueNAS is the replacement for FreeNAS, chances are we're probably going to look at it and try and incorporate it into the lab to give our educational classes the best possible experience that we can.
Well, you also said you gave us a college try at the NetApp I'm surprised we didn't go with an ONTAP virtual edition, but you said you ran into issues with that, and it was just like, you know what, I got other things to work on. Let me just go the easier path to start with.
Yeah, I couldn't get it going, and maybe it was just me. But, I'd be happy to revisit that.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you get stuck in that headspace, right? If somebody else take a ran at it fresh, it might,
Mhm.
Yep,
But
absolutely.
your head into the wall for so long, you just need to stop. Yeah.
Yep.
But I like it too because at first it can be frustrating if you just started Ivoxy and you're like, what the heck? But after a while you realize it's a benefit and a virtue of ours that we don't have one way of doing things at Ivoxy, and it's not that we're scatterbrained. It's not that we don't have standards or best practices, because we do. We share a lot of the same best practices, but in IT, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, right? Or at least more than one. And I like it that we're not boxed in that this is the way we do it. When we have a project, we have knowledge transfer calls, we have internal meetings and discussions over the best way to approach certain things. That does not always go down the same path for a similar project, which I think is pretty cool because we always defer to the situation. And I personally, and I'm guessing you guys would agree, but might approach it differently. I always defer to the what are we trying to accomplish here question.
Yeah,
I go back to that,
always.
our base, because a lot of times it's easy to get into the weeds with, ooh, fancy knob. Well, okay, you potentially could introduce issues with that. What are we trying to accomplish with this? And if it's to scratch a nerdy itch, I get it. As long as you admit it to yourself too, Mr. Customer, and
If that's
understand the
reason,
pitfalls
yep.
that could go along with it, that's fine. But if we're trying to create a completely stable environment, I will caution against going down that road because there's not a lot of benefit outside of that nerd bug. So I
Yep.
do like that there are more than one way to skin a cat, and that we all kind of have that freedom to go down those roads as we see fit.
Yeah, I'd even add to that. Like when we built the lab, we tried to build it like we were going to have to use it on a daily basis too, right? So there's nothing worse than kind of just throwing something in there and go, I just want to swear at this thing today, you know. So
Mm-hmm.
Well, the what you just said rings true, Shane. We have operation workloads to run on there, and if that's
Yep.
nothing more than NSX Manager and our backup and just things that need to operate a domain controller that really the classes depend on, but they don't depend on the classes, right? So they always need to be running. Um, NSXT, I would say, is the one largest component that's enabled us to truly isolate. And if NSX and all of it, all the components, and Kazo could probably shake his head and say, can't happen, wouldn't happen, bad design. But let's just say NSX
No,
decides
it's
to
still
go.
terrifying.
It can be right, but
Yeah.
let's just say NSX says, as a whole, guys, pack it up, we're out of here.
I'm taking a break. I'll be back later. Yeah.
yeah,
Right. Would the lab still now not the class, right? But would the lab and the underlying lab infrastructure would still be humming along, correct?
Like the VMs running?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, they'd be running, but no one could talk to them.
No, that's not true. Domain controller's not running on an NSX segment, is it?
Oh, not the pods, but all of the infrastructure that's supporting
I mean,
it.
forget the classes itself would go, but
Right,
the
okay.
class could that building could fall without knocking into
Right. Right.
the
So
core
yes,
of the lab.
yes, the way we designed it was so that everything management operationally runs on your traditional set of equipment. So we've got layer 3 switches, we've got the firewall, we've got everything comes in that way through the hardware that needs to be there anyway. And
Yep.
then all of the class stuff is kind of over off the side using
And
some routing.
That's not
Yeah.
to say we couldn't have set it all up on NSXT segments. It's just a matter of we're leveraging NSXT to create that flexibility, that scriptability, and our domain controllers, they're not a repeated task. They're they're staying there.
Right. I mean, even the VMware validated designs and whatnot recommend that the vCenter, your management stuff, Active Directory, DNS, all of that sits over in its management cluster, and it's supported by bare metal and network equipment, and it's not virtualized as we'd get into the like deploying these pods would be. So we still kind of took that approach. If you look at the designs, they'd say build your own 3-node, 4-node ESX cluster just for management stuff. So we're kind of a hybrid of that, where some of the network adapters are physically ran off of the network with just VLAN tags, as we've been doing for forever. And then here's this other set of stuff where, in parallel on the same set of gear, we're just we're building it all software-wise, and then we're sharing CPU, sharing memory.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, Cause. One of the main drivers for NSXT was each of the pods all use the same IP scheme, as opposed to all of our management stuff is unique from that perspective.
Right. So that was one of the things we were looking at when we were doing design. We all kind of said, yes, let's not have our classes run where here's your lab guide, and you read through it and you find that X and you replace your lab number with X, or you replace X with your lab number to get to your stuff. We didn't want to have to do that. So everyone gets the same copy of the lab guide. The addressing is exactly the same. The names are exactly the same. So to facilitate that, yeah, we did have to lean on some networking pieces. There was an aha moment for me when I went, ooh, that's how we can make that happen.
Yeah, and credit to you on that, Kaz, because you're
Yep.
the one who kind of shuffled through the NSX swamp to learn it and
I got my
learn how we needed to do it. We knew what we wanted to do, but like, okay, how do I get there?
that
was all
unicorn
you.
floaty. I'm floating around in that swamp right now.
That's right.
Yeah,
Well,
That
it's
was awesome.
it's Masters Week, so I'll give you this.
There we go.
It's the
golf clap.
It's the golf
Golf
clap.
clap, yeah.
we see him approaching the NSXT transport node. Wait, he's gone ahead and missed it. He's missed the configuration.
That's
Well,
right.
before we wrap it up, Shane, you said you had a little bit of a funny story, and we had you hold off. Now I'm anxious to hear it, but would you mind sharing? Give us a setup here. What we got?
I will. I just want to add one other thing about our discussion is really, I think one of the differentiators that Ivoxy aimed for when we built this lab was normally when you take a class from somebody, Thursday or Friday afternoon at 5 p.m., the lab's burnt down. But we wanted to make sure that we can offer the lab to anybody who wants it for the week following, so you can actually, practice or double practice what you actually learned or heard in the class the previous week. So I just wanted to throw that out there because that was one of the things that we had to take into account when we did it. Because if we decide to run another class in parallel the following week, we did have to account for those resources as well.
Yeah, and I think ideally we want to run simultaneous classes, and from a resource standpoint and the cost associated with that, the justification is if we're running two classes simultaneously, the revenue generated can cover the cost of the increased lab capacity.
Yeah.
And I feel comfortable we could do it anyway. I mean, from a storage standpoint, Pure is he's bored back there.
Yeah.
I feel bad.
From the storage point of view, yeah.
Yeah.
So I've been
Yep.
to that point. I've been working with Keith on getting his lab spun up, and
Yeah.
he's doing some network stuff. Shane, we went light to get your class compared to what Keith needs to get that virtual environment up for the routers and whatnot.
Really?
Those are some big VMs, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
You don't think about it when you're virtualizing networking, right? But in those switches, they're not like that money goes towards resources, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not your
CPU, there's
traditional
memory in there, yeah.
Yeah.
right.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, they're typically like custom ASICs. So when you translate that to a generic, x86 platform and then memory in that point, and forget
Mhm.
your buffers,
Mhm.
they'll have to live in RAM.
Yep.
So okay, so how big is a Keith pod? So Shane's pod is 60 gig for one. What's a Keith
How
pod?
big is a Keith pod? Here, hang on one sec. We went small. We toned it down. We toned it
Oh,
down
no.
to the GNS3 server has 4 CPUs and 32 gigs of memory.
And how many of them are
That's
there?
one server.
That's one GNS server per pod, and then
Wow.
3 more. There's Ansible. There's a Ansible tower, and then
Yep.
I think a workstation machine. So those are all like 2 and 4. But we brought
probably-
it down to 32 gigs and down to 4 CPUs, and now we're kind of at that question
50?
of, do we need some more? Do we need some less? Is the performance of this environment acceptable, or is it okay to have a little longer of a boot time, because that boot storm, not just the VMs but the virtualized environment, those virtual routers, those virtual switches, booting all of those up, that's going to take a little longer when we've gone down.
Well, we've seen almost the opposite of what we typically see in a real world production environment. A typical workload that's not a training class is that we usually see RAM as the limiting factor.
We're starting to be
We run out
CPU
of
bound,
versus
yeah.
got CPU to burn, and now we're kind of like, well, RAM can compress down. We can share the CPU, and then you got to be careful too, because if you've got a VM that's traditionally bored, and I don't know if your GNS server is. I think it probably is pretty constant on the CPU. I'm guessing. But if you've got 4, 6, 8 vCPUs on a domain controller, bad idea, because you'll have a lot of idle CPU.
Yeah.
But why is everything slow? Because it can't get a schedule.
Yep.
Yep.
And that's what we were running into, is like, oh wow,
You're threading that needle.
look at that schedule time. Look at that CPU ready.
Look at that co-stop.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Interesting.
Well, that's another day for the lab. Here, you want to hear the funny
Let's
story
do it.
my wife did?
Yeah.
Okay, so this was a group chat between myself, my wife, and a buddy of mine, Ron, who I go cave diving with. But that was
Crazy.
it was a previous chat. So I'm
Never gonna be okay with that.
yeah, I'm actually on a call with Eric and some of the guys from Ivoxy the other day, and this text comes across my phone and it says, "Morning, Ron. Want to get Shane a saw for Christmas. Do you think a miter saw or a circular saw would be more handy, or do you know of any other tools he was looking at or could use?" And he responds, is this supposed to be a surprise? Because Big Brother is watching. Because I'm on the thread.
Because it's a group chat.
Yeah. And my wife responds, "Oops, I just saw that. Damn it."
So now you're getting a drill
Well-
instead of a saw.
Yeah, right. Let me tell you, your wife's on point, because those are my two most useful tools, and I would have a tough time if I had to get one taken away from me. I'd probably
Yeah.
say I'd rather have the miter box, because
Oh yeah.
I'm using it
You-
more often. But
you
they
can do
are
a lot
key.
with a straight edge and a circular saw.
I already have one
Let
of
me
those.
tell you something.
Mhm.
And a circular saw, if it's plug-in, get a battery-powered one.
Really, eh? Okay, cool.
No.
Dragging that, I need to go out there and cut that pallet out. Oh, Kazo, trust me. If you don't have to be tethered by that cord, get one of the Milwaukee M18s, boom, and you just, it's fantastic. Not worrying about power, it's fantastic.
Okay, this could go like way off the rails.
It really could.
Why would you want to use a circular saw to cut a pallet when you can use a chainsaw? I'll leave it at that.
I don't have a chainsaw.
Or
So
or
that, I mean,
my preference, if I'm going to go do something like that, is the reciprocating saw. And
Yeah,
I do have a
there you go.
battery-powered reciprocating saw.
okay,
Yeah.
no.
Sure.
I
I mean,
hate
those-
the Sawzall.
Those round blades, and you're going to hit a nail, and oh my word.
No, I hate the Sawzall. Let me tell you something. Over 3 years ago, about 3 years ago around this time, my wife and I, my father-in-law, and my wife's uncle out from Milwaukee were renovating, gutting the inside of this house. That Sawzall, I don't know what the long-term effects of vibrating your skeleton are at a high rate for a long time, but I think I'm still sore from that freaking roller coaster. I hate the Sawzall. You can't get a precise cut. It shakes you more than it shakes it.
Well,
It's terrible.
you're not doing. I mean, if you're cutting up a pallet, you aren't doing anything precise with that.
No.
No, I know. I'm just that big flopping blade that just goes around, and I know you can bend it around, and that's fine. But you know what? Give me something solid that's not going to shiver me timbers. Every time I turn it on.
I will say, in relation to the circular blades, the circular saw you can do a lot with, but a table saw is spectacular. My biggest issue, I've got my landlord's old table saw he's left here for me. Thank you. Thank you also, Matt.
Yeah.
But I need
Other
a
Matt.
longer fence because I've only got like 24 inches that I can cut on that
Yeah.
table saw, and it's not big enough to do anything.
We call mine Jack the Ripper.
There you go.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well-
Okay, you know what? Write in, if you wouldn't mind. Write in whether it's on Twitter or on LinkedIn. Maybe LinkedIn might be the easiest way. What would you rather have? If a crucial tool in your toolbox, would you rather have a miter saw, a circular saw, a reciprocating sawzall, or the table saw?
There you go.
Yeah.
There you
For
go.
those of you listening, you can let your spouse or other half kind of listen to this episode for Christmas ideas.
There you go.
Yeah. Enjoy your drill, Shane.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to yet another episode of Data Center Therapy. Shane, thanks for joining us, man. It's great to have you on, and looking forward to next time.
It was my pleasure. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, everyone. Have a great one.
Good night.
All right.